Good evening, and thank you for joining us. This is Isabella from United News Network. Tonight, a major decision from the United States Supreme Court is reshaping the rules governing money in federal elections, just months before the November midterm contests. In a 6-3 ruling, the court struck down federal limits on how much political parties can spend in coordination with their candidates for Congress and president. The decision affects a long-standing provision of federal campaign finance law and gives national and state party organizations far greater freedom to work directly with candidates on advertising, voter outreach, and other campaign efforts. The case is called National Republican Senatorial Committee versus the Federal Election Commission. The challenge was brought by Republican campaign organizations and other plaintiffs, including Vice President J.D. Vance, who joined the lawsuit while he was still serving in the Senate. At the center of the case was a simple but consequential question: can the federal government limit spending by a political party when that spending is coordinated with a candidate's campaign? Before this ruling, the answer was yes. Federal law set caps on coordinated expenditures by political parties. Those limits varied depending on the office and the state involved. The goal was to prevent wealthy donors from bypassing the individual contribution limits that apply directly to candidates. For example, under the previous system, a donor could not simply give an unlimited amount of money to a candidate's campaign, but critics of the old rules worried that, without limits on party spending, a donor could give large sums to a party with the expectation that the party would then spend heavily to help one specific candidate. The Supreme Court had upheld those coordinated spending limits in a 2001 decision, but the court's new ruling overturns that precedent. Writing for the majority, Justice Brett Kavanaugh said the restrictions violated the First Amendment's protections for political speech. The majority concluded that political parties, whether Democratic, Republican, or otherwise, should be allowed to coordinate their political spending with candidates without the government-imposed limits that had been in place for decades. The court's conservative majority said the restrictions treated political parties differently from other groups that can spend large amounts independently to influence elections. In recent years, outside organizations, including super PACs and nonprofit groups, have been able to spend unlimited sums as long as they do not coordinate directly with candidates. The majority's reasoning is that political parties should not face a tighter restriction when they are directly supporting their own nominees. The 3 liberal justices dissented. Justice Elena Kagan wrote that the decision could make it easier for wealthy donors to channel large amounts of money toward individual candidates through political parties. In the dissent, the justices warned that the ruling weakens safeguards intended to reduce the risk of corruption or the appearance of corruption in federal elections. That disagreement reflects a larger and long-standing divide over campaign finance law in the United States. Supporters of stricter limits argue that money can create unequal access to elected officials and give wealthy donors too much influence over public policy. They say campaign finance rules are needed to protect public confidence in elections and to ensure that political power is not determined primarily by financial resources. Opponents of those limits argue that spending money to communicate political views is a form of protected speech. They say government restrictions can limit the ability of parties, candidates, and citizens to make their case to voters. This ruling is the latest in a series of Supreme Court decisions that have loosened campaign finance restrictions. The most widely known was the court's 2010 decision in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. That ruling allowed corporations and unions to spend unlimited amounts independently to support or oppose candidates. But there is an important distinction between independent spending and coordinated spending. Independent spending is supposed to occur without consultation or cooperation with a candidate's campaign. A super PAC, for example, can run advertisements supporting a candidate, but it is not supposed to coordinate its strategy, messaging, or spending with that candidate's campaign. Coordinated spending is different. It involves direct cooperation between a party organization and a candidate's campaign. Under the Supreme Court's new ruling, political parties will now have much more latitude to coordinate that spending with the candidates they support. The immediate effect could be felt in the upcoming midterm elections. National party committees are already central players in competitive House and Senate races. They raise money, recruit candidates, conduct polling, organize voter contact programs, and buy television and digital advertising. The new ruling could allow those committees to take on an even larger role in the campaigns of individual candidates. Republicans may have an early financial advantage under the new rules. Recent federal filings showed that the Republican National Committee and the party's congressional campaign arms had more cash on hand than their Democratic counterparts. That does not guarantee electoral success, but it could give Republican organizations greater flexibility to invest quickly in closely contested races. Democrats, meanwhile, are expected to argue that the decision increases the influence of large donors and party leaders. Democratic officials had defended the law in court, even as some Democrats have also acknowledged that the previous restrictions limited the ability of political parties to compete with well-funded outside groups. Republicans have generally welcomed the ruling. Their argument is that political parties are accountable organizations with public platforms, known leaders, and legal disclosure requirements. They contend that allowing parties to coordinate more freely with candidates could reduce the influence of outside groups that often operate with less transparency. That point is likely to become a central part of the political debate. Some campaign finance experts say the ruling may shift money away from super PACs and toward party committees. If donors see parties as a more direct and effective way to support candidates, national committees could become more powerful than they have been in recent election cycles. Others say the practical effects may be more complicated. Super PACs and outside organizations still have major fundraising networks, established advertising operations, and significant influence. The new ruling does not eliminate contribution limits that apply directly to candidates, and it does not remove all campaign finance disclosure rules. It also does not legalize bribery, and it does not erase laws against direct exchanges of money for official action. Those laws remain in place. But critics say the decision makes it more difficult to draw clear lines between ordinary political support and the kind of financial influence that campaign finance regulations were designed to address. The legal path to this decision began in 2022, when Republican House and Senate campaign committees filed suit in Ohio. The plaintiffs argued that the coordinated spending limits violated the First Amendment. The case reached the Supreme Court after years of litigation. By the time it was argued before the justices, the political environment had changed as well. The Federal Election Commission, under the Trump administration, did not continue defending the law in the same way previous administrations had. Democratic committees were allowed to participate in the case to argue in favor of keeping the limits. During oral arguments, the justices openly debated whether the limits protected against corruption or instead unfairly restricted political parties. The ruling now resolves that legal dispute, at least for the moment. Congress could consider new campaign finance legislation, but any future law would have to fit within the constitutional limits described by the Supreme Court. That will not be easy. Congress remains closely divided, and campaign finance reform has long been one of the most difficult issues for lawmakers to address. Any proposal to create new limits would likely face legal challenges, especially after this decision. The ruling may also influence how candidates organize their campaigns. Rather than relying as heavily on outside groups, candidates may work more closely with their party's national committees. That could affect everything from television advertising to campaign messaging, fundraising strategy, and voter turnout operations. For voters, the most visible change may be an increase in party-directed advertising and coordinated campaign activity in competitive districts and states. In a closely divided Congress, Even a small number of races can determine control of the House or Senate. That means party committees may focus their expanded resources on a limited number of high-stakes contests. The broader question is whether the decision will strengthen political parties or further deepen concerns about the role of money in American democracy. Supporters say stronger parties could bring more accountability to the system. Unlike many outside organizations, political parties must publicly identify themselves, nominate candidates, and answer to voters on Election Day. Critics say the ruling creates another avenue for wealthy donors to exert influence. They argue that voters may have more difficulty knowing whether large donations are shaping campaign priorities and policy positions. Those competing arguments are likely to be heard repeatedly in the months ahead, not only in courtrooms and congressional hearings, but also in campaign speeches, fundraising appeals, and political advertisements. The decision arrives at a time when public trust in institutions remains a major issue in American politics. Polls have shown that many voters across the political spectrum are concerned about the influence of money in elections. At the same time, Americans continue to disagree sharply over whether campaign spending should be treated primarily as political expression or as a potential source of undue influence. The Supreme Court has now made its position clear on this particular question. Political parties may not be subject to federal limits on coordinated expenditures with their candidates. What happens next will depend on how parties, candidates, donors, and regulators respond. The Federal Election Commission will need to determine how to apply the ruling in practice. Political committees will likely review their fundraising and spending plans. Campaign lawyers will examine the decision closely, especially as they advise candidates in competitive races. And lawmakers may face renewed pressure to consider whether existing disclosure requirements are sufficient in a system where political parties can now coordinate unlimited spending with their nominees. For now, the decision marks one of the most significant changes to federal campaign finance law in years. It expands the role political parties can play in direct support of candidates and sets the stage for a new phase in the debate over money, speech, and power in American elections. That is the latest on this developing story. We'll continue to follow how the ruling affects the midterm campaigns and any response from Congress or federal election regulators. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Thank you for your support. Have a nice day, everyone.